Good morning, and welcome again to the 38th Annual Frank Church Conference on Democracy on the Brink, The View from the Mountain West, sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Gary Wensky, and I'm the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. Our keynote speaker is Celinda Lake, founder and president of Lake Research Partners, a national public opinion and political strategy firm based in Washington, D.C. Celinda Lake is a leading political strategist and a pollster for President Biden. Lake Research is known for its accuracy and cutting-edge research on issues, and she is one of the nation's foremost experts on electing women candidates. American politics has called her a super-strategist, or better yet, the Godmother. And Working Woman said that she is arguably the most influential woman in her field. A native of Montana, Celinda Lake was born and raised on a ranch. She graduated summa cum laude from Smith College and earned a master's degree in political science and survey research from the University of Michigan. She received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Political Consultants, and she co-authored What Women Really Want. Please welcome our friend, Celinda Lake.
Thank you so much. I am truly delighted to be with you, and I wish I were there in person. Want to thank Gary. We've worked for years together, and it's really, really a pleasure to see him and the leadership that the Church Institute has had, and I know you had the pleasure of hearing from Peter Fenn as well, just a tremendous friend and a tremendous analyst. So we want to share with you, and we'll load the presentation up now, some slides from the national scene, and we can note for you some of the trends in the region and also what just happened in the most recent elections. And I want to thank David Merman and Jacqueline Jutton, who were the team responsible for all of this hard work. I also want to say that I can't think of a more apt title than Democracy on the Brink, and it's interesting because Frank Center Church was a leader at a time when democracy was also on the brink, but I think in many ways we haven't seen anything like we are seeing today. So let's jump right into the data. Delighted to take your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to deal with them either as we're going or at the end. So Americans are very concerned about our democracy. And as you saw, relatively low confidence, even in local and state elections. And in fact, the regional data in the Rocky Mountain West is more positive towards state and local. But you see a number of people who are very, very concerned even about state and local government, much less the federal government. And you see an alarming developments around violence. And you see not only that people expect violence, and in work that we do with the Terrence Group, a Republican polling firm that works a lot in the region, and for the Georgetown School of Public Policy, we have found on a scale from 0 to 100, people at 76.7, or virtually at almost nearing a sense that we are on the verge of civil war, but also people willing to resolve problems with violence. And we'll show you some of that data. Democrats have a slight advantage among registered voters in 2022, but there are a number of key factors that show tremendous gains for Republicans and really a supercharged Republican electorate in 2022. We also see increased enthusiasm for rural and white non-college voters, and a lot of Democratic base and surge voters actually saying that they are disengaging. There has been most recently falling approval ratings for President Biden and for both parties in Congress, and Congress really in disrepute. But with the passage of the infrastructure and perhaps the passage of the Build Back Better, we're hoping to see the ability to shift that narrative to really talk about what Democrats are delivering to families to help with their problems. But people are really looking for leaders who are in touch, leaders who have experience, leaders who will deliver help for their families and solve problems. We also have, of course, the structural and historic patterns of the president's party, no matter which party, losing in the midterm elections. And then we have the gerrymandering, and there are clearly going to be an increase through redistricting in majority Republican districts. The estimates are very different here. They could be anywhere from 2.5 seats to 7 seats or more. There is also, and I think this is one of the things that many of us from the Rocky Mountain West are most concerned about, there's a dramatic distrust in the media and a real perception that misinformation is on the rise, but a real feeling of inability to do anything about that. And people recognize now that they are very, very poor consumers of misinformation and really can't distinguish facts from lies or misinformation, disinformation. And there are a lot of people promoting that from a campaign standpoint. In 2018, we analyzed this in Montana, your neighboring state, and we found that Montana's used to, and I'm sure Idaho, you feel the same way, we're used to being compared of the most cows per person, which we always laugh at. Well, we had the 4th highest bots per person in Montana in 2018. Now, the bots aren't really that active. The Russians are less active because so much is happening in a homegrown way. And the Rocky Mountain region is really, really high in that level of activity. Voters want elected officials to work together, and they think that working together is critical to getting things done. And that is particularly a strong sentiment among women voters. And finally, we have the Freedom to Vote Act. And while there are some controversies around the Freedom to Vote Act, there's very, very strong support for creating national standards to provide equal access to voting and restore confidence in our elections, and a lot of sentiment behind getting dark money and special interest money out of elections. And that is a particularly strong sentiment in the Rocky Mountain region, particularly strong among rural voters and blue-collar voters. So if that's some of the things that are going on, let's go look at some of the data and see what you think. So first off, on election integrity, and this is something that you saw already in the morning briefing in your morning consult poll, but people feel there's a very serious threat to our democracy, and this is a bipartisan sentiment. And though people may be focused on different things, people are really split about which party is more of a threat, and independents tend to think both parties are a threat. People also think that they have doubts in their state and local governments. That is a little bit higher among in the Rocky Mountain West, but Republicans in general tend to have less confidence in state and local governments, and Democrats and independents worry about the ability to have accurate elections. Republicans are more worried about fraud, and you saw in the morning consult poll this really high number of Republicans, even in our Western region, who thought that people who were not eligible to vote were voting. Democrats and independents tend to be more worried about people not being allowed to vote, and they feel particularly strongly that elected officials may be influencing who can vote because they don't like the outcomes that happened. Everybody believes that election should be a time when the voters decide and pick the politicians, not the politicians picking their voters. People have a lot of confidence in their local elected officials, and this is true for Democratic and Republican local elected officials. But you still say 1 in 5 Republicans who say they have no confidence in their local election boards. So even the local aspect, which has been the real underpinning, is being questioned, less so in the Rocky Mountain states, actually, than nationwide, but still to a damaging and dangerous degree, I think. If we look at the next slide, needless to say, the integrity of the election, particularly when it focuses on the 2020 election and when it focuses on Donald Trump, is very partisanly divided. So people tend to think that elections are fair, but this is a very partisanly polarized attitude. And people tend to think that Donald Trump did not win the election, although this too is a very partisanly polarized faction. And while the Rocky Mountain region tends to be exempt from some of these national trends, you saw in your Morning Consult poll that people were divided right at the 50% mark in terms of whether Trump was the legitimate winner of the election or Biden was the legitimate winner of the election. This is a really new development for us. People have not in the past questioned the winner of the elections. They didn't after 2016 for as long, and they haven't stayed in doubt for as long. And there is a very, very serious challenge here about the legitimacy of our elections. There is also, as we said, Republicans more concerned about fraud, and you saw that data in the Morning Consult poll as well, and Democrats more concerned about vote tampering by the opposite party and voter suppression. And independents, a little bit worried about both, but leaning more toward voter suppression. Independents also tend to be very, very concerned about the influence of special interests on both parties. If we look at the next slide, you can see here big differences in terms of whether your vote will be counted fairly. And look at the drop off between 2020 and 2021. So in 2020, 85% of the voters thought their votes would be counted accurately and fairly. In October 2021, only 66% of the voters felt that would be true. And the biggest drop off with Republicans, 84% of Republicans thinking it was true in 2020, only 41% of Republicans thinking it was true in 2021. This is a very, very, very serious development in our system. And our bipartisanship, our local elected officials tended to protect against this sentiment. And that has really changed now in 2021. And I think that one of the things for the long-term well-being of our system, we want to make sure that we really restore our feelings of legitimacy in our election, the bipartisanship, the local elected officials, and the Democrats and Republicans who work together locally to ensure our elections. We see a major factor in the 2020. If we look at the next slide, in the 2024 elections, people are projecting this forward. They do not think it is a one-time phenomenon. And so you have 82% of the Democrats and 68% of independents who feel that their vote will be, you can trust the results of the 2024 election, but only 33% of Republicans who believe this. And again, this is very, very serious threat. We've never seen this level of partisan polarization. We've never seen this level of durability. And ironically, the independents, who are usually the least trusting, are resembling more the Democrats right now than they are the Republicans. And that has traditionally not been true. It has particularly not been true in our Rocky Mountain states. We also see this distrust of elections being accompanied with a startling high rise in proclivity toward violence. And so we have now a number of media sources, Fox News, One America News, Newsmax, really promoting the idea that the election was stolen And that is fueling a sense that violence may be necessary to deal with it. And you used to have these sentiments of violence being necessary to deal with the elections is directly correlated with the amount of One America News, Newsmax news that you consume, also with the amount of Fox News that you consume. And again, we're seeing here Republicans very different from Democrats and independents. Used to be that independents were our most discouraged, and now you see independents actually more trusting than Republicans. The other group that is really becoming distrusting, that is very, very important in our Rocky Mountain states, is white evangelicals. And you see 60% of white evangelicals believing the election was stolen from Trump. This has not been talked about very much. And the white evangelicals, the most concerned of all, the most likely of all religious groups to say that true American patriots might have to resort to violence in order to save our country. It's still a small faction, only 26% agreeing with that, but the dramatic rise in the concern about violence, and voters overall think that that violence is equal, that violence on the left and violence on the right is equal. In the data, it actually shows more proclivity among conservative forces to contemplate violence right now than liberal forces, but voters overall believe that violence is a problem, a huge problem, and they're very concerned about it on the left as well as on the right. Here you can see some of that polling, and you can see 30% of Republicans saying that we may have to consider violence, because true patriots may have to consider violence. And we see it has increased, and increased over time rather than decreased. There are many people who thought that January 6th might push away from this sentiment and decrease the appetite for this sentiment, to have such a visual and threatening example. And you have Liz Cheney and some other folks being so articulate about this. But in fact, actually post January 6th, we've seen some increase in the sentiment that violence may be necessary, not a decrease in the sentiment that violence might be necessary. If your Morning Consult poll, and I think this polling nationwide shows some really, really disturbing trends, let's look at what happened in the 2021 elections and see what it portends for the 2022 elections. First of all, you saw record high turnout. When Northam had been elected, the previous Democratic governor, with very high turnout, 65% of the presidential voters turned out to vote. In this year, 74% of the voters turned out to vote. Presidential year voters turned out to vote. But the Republicans were supercharged. The Democrats beat their previous record, but the Republicans were supercharged. And I think that there was a very, very important lesson that came out of the 2021 elections, which is that the Republicans can be supercharged even when Trump is not on the ballot and even when Trump does not come into the state. So I think you're going to see record high turnout in 2022, but particularly among Republican voters. The other thing that you saw is that what issue you were focused on really determined your vote. So if you were concerned about COVID, you tended to vote Democratic. If you thought the economy was in good shape, you tended to vote Democratic. But if you thought, if you were concerned about the economy, concerned about taxes, concerned about education, or concerned about abortion, you tended to vote Republican. And the pro-life forces were more energized actually than the pro-choice voters. And economy the number one issue out there, and people tending to think the economy was in bad shape and tending to vote Republican if they thought the economy was in bad shape. If we look at the next slide, you can see there's been a lot of talk about the parenting narrative post 2021. And of course, ex-Governor McAuliffe made the very unfortunate statement that parents should not be involved in their children's education. Only 14% of voters agree with that nationwide. Only 14% of the voters agreed with that in Virginia. And of course, they voted for McAuliffe, but the rest of the voters voted for Youngkin. But it wasn't just families with children who voted that way. So you'll see here that the vote among parents and the vote among non-parents of children under 18 was identical in Virginia. The conventional wisdom says that Democrats lost because of parenting. They lost because of the parenting issue was a prominent issue, but we lost that narrative with people who were parents and people who were not parents. There was a gender gap in Virginia as well, women voting more Democratic, men voting more Republican. That was true whether or not you had children. And the enthusiasm among men for the Republicans was greater than the enthusiasm among women for Democrats. That you currently see in the Rocky Mountain region as well. And you saw this already as a precursor to 2022. In the Rocky Mountain region in 2020, you saw men more enthusiastic for the Republicans than women were for the Democrats. So there is a gender gap, but it was a gender gap that worked against us. What's likely to happen in the midterms? Well, first of all, just historically, the out party really loses seats. And you can see the couple of times that that's not been true are rare indeed for either party. What the president's job performance is correlates directly to how many seats you lose. And the job performance, as well as the rating on the economy in May, is the single most predictive of the votes. But you can see there have been losses in the 50s, 60s, 70s in a number of elections, but at least losing by double digits. And remember, the margin right now, only 3 seats. So structurally and historically, it would be very, very unusual for there to be less turnover than less loss than would predict a turnover. And then you add the redistricting overlay, and the Democrats are facing a very, very uphill climb. You also have turnout, and turnout affected by the enthusiasm of both parties and their relative sense of loss, also affected by the structure and the laws. Now, most of the Western states have pretty high participation rates and have pretty active systems that allow people to participate in lots of ways, although there have been some changes in the laws recently. But you'll see here that there's no question that what the laws are in terms of voting rights affects the vote, and that turnout systematically increased, and most dramatically, ironically, in 2018, when we had more voting rights that were more insured and access that was more insured. In 2022, in 2021, you see that enthusiasm was higher in both Virginia and New Jersey for Republicans. And in fact, they were supercharged. And that enthusiasm among voters was very predictive of very strongly related to the president's job approval, which at the time was upside down. But Democrats a little discouraged by what they perceived as things not getting done. Republicans supercharged by what they perceived being proposed. Here you can see the next slide will show you the job performance over time. And you can see that the job performance has declined over time. This is very comparable to what we see for most presidents and was affected by Delta, affected by the economy, affected by Afghanistan. The question will be with the passage of the infrastructure bill and perhaps the passage of Build Back Better, do those numbers come up a little bit? And the most predictive right now, in the beginning months, the most predictive of the president's job approval was what you thought was going on with COVID. Now, the most predictive of the job performance for the president is what you think is happening with the economy. And that is even more predictive if we look at the next slide, even more predictive of the vote than what you think is going on with COVID. COVID is the president's strongest job performance area. The economy, people have been pretty harsh in their judgment, and they have decoupled COVID and the economy. They now think the policies that we need in the economy are separate from the policies that we needed with COVID. If we look at the next slide, you can see the tremendous partisan polarization. And you can see Democrats, people talk about the Democrats being divided and the division between the left and the right. There actually isn't much division among Democrats. And the average here is 92% of Democrats happy with the president. There also isn't much division among Republicans. We have only 4% of Republicans who are happy with the president. The decline has been most precipitous among the independents, and it's particularly dramatic among independent women. If we look at the next slide, you can see this is America upset about everything. Upset about their personal economic well-being, very upset about the Delta variant. It was a real kick in the gut. That's receding right now, but people still concerned about climate change and the manifestation of that, rising prices, division in America, and people going into the fall here pretty dismayed and distraught. The number one variable right now is control. People think they have almost no control over anything, and they're really, really concerned about the instability, particularly women voters, about the instability of what's going on and what are they going to be surprised at. And will our political system, Democrat or Republican, respond and work together? The base and surge voters for the Democrats are also disengaging. We see a number of them saying they're avoiding following and engaging in news. And Democrats, particularly in the Rocky Mountain region, actually feel like they are surrounded by Trump supporters. So they feel very, very isolated, very unlikely to engage because they don't want to further divide their friendship networks or their families, particularly in the holiday season. Swing voters tend to be worried about both sides. They think that both sides are not delivering. Voters of color, particularly African American voters, feel very discouraged and frustrated because they feel like they turned out in record numbers, delivered the results, and then are not benefiting. And no one cares about the process. It's been very harmful to both parties that we've had a discussion that has focused on the process, that has focused on the budget, that is focused on the numbers rather than what those numbers buy. And in both parties have paid a real price for not discussing, as we say in our business, it's not about the brownie mix, it's about the brownie. Duncan Hines doesn't sell you the mix, they sell you the brownie on the front cover of that box. The one thing that's quite unique right now is that Democratic policies or ideas are more popular than their leaders. This was not true for Obama. In the beginning of his term, he was more popular than his policies, particularly ACA. Right now, Democratic policies are more popular than Democratic leadership. And this is a real challenge for the Republicans. Voters think a third of Republicans voted for the recovery package, when of course none did. And part of that is because the policies were so popular, many people came back out to talk about what had been passed. So it'll be interesting to see how Republican members who didn't vote or Republican governors who were not in favor of the policies handle it once they're passed. That said, people aren't hearing about anything. They're hearing much more about division and not hearing very much about, if we look at the next slide, what's in the bipartisan infrastructure bill or what is in Build Back Better. And people have no idea of the content of either one. A little bit more idea that infrastructure must mean roads and bridges, but very unclear about what's coming back to their state. And then absolutely only a quarter of the voters have any idea what's in Build Back Better. The redistricting process, both for the state legislature and the Congress, is going to make a big difference. And there is still a lot of gerrymandering going on, led by Republicans for the most part in swing states, but a lot of gerrymandering going on, and voters very, very anti-gerrymandering. But it will have an impact. What the redistricting does will have an impact on the elections, both for state leg and for Congress. So what do we do about restoring confidence? If democracy is on the brink, as you say, what can we do about restoring confidence across parties? And if we look at the next slide, you can see, for the most part, it is really, really being jeopardized in some states. There are 33 states where there has been a bad laws passed in terms of voter access and democracy, and they tend to be disproportionately Republican-controlled states. Where power is divided, it's been a much more even hand in terms of what has passed, and then the Democrats don't tend to have passed most of these policies. So we have to fight to maintain our elections. The Freedom to Vote Act, very, very popular with the voters. Now, the voters don't even know it exists, and they are completely unclear about what's in it. But when it's described here as equal access to voting, redrawing in a fair way, and guaranteeing all votes are counted by nonpartisan local election officials, 70% of all voters support it, 85% of Democrats, 54% of Republicans, 67% of independents. So the Freedom to Vote Act, which nobody knows exists, quite popular with voters, and voters for the first time actually interested in national standards. The things that are most popular for voters, if we look at the next slide, vote by mail, early voting, making the election day a holiday, registering to vote online. People are still a little nervous about voting online. They have gotten significantly less concerned about whether you can register online. National standards for acceptable forms. People like voter ID. They feel very strongly about voter ID. They believe that you have to have IDs now for everything. Why wouldn't you have to have an ID for voting? But they like the idea of making the ID process more accessible, accepting multiple kinds of IDs, paying for IDs if people don't have the resources, having mobile ID distribution. People like IDs, but they're also ready to make that part of the process acceptable. And then preventing purges of voters from the voter files. In fact, voters don't understand why the politicians have access to the voter files, period. Things that are really, really popular and are really kind of more core values than they are policies are local lawmakers being prevented from overturning election laws. And in those states that have initiatives, preventing them from overturning the will of the people as expressed by initiatives, protecting local elected officials from harassment and interference, setting national standards for equipment, increasing penalties for voter intimidation, and local post-election audits that preserve election records. All of those things very, very popular with people and really almost core values, not even disputed. Voter empowerment is also very popular. National standards for drawing congressional districts, courts enforcing those standards, and requiring campaign finance reform and full disclosure, very, very popular. And these Rocky Mountain states, who are populist when it comes to money, also really disliking special interest money in politics. This is particularly strong in Montana, but strong in all of the region states. Which things you're most interested in? There's a lot of bipartisan consensus on these policies, but there's also a lot of things that are popular, a little bit more popular depending on the party. So protecting local elected officials, very popular with Democrats. Preventing voter intimidation, vote by mail, and preventing lawmakers from overturning elections, all very popular with Democrats. Independents, like increasing the penalties for voter intimidation. Campaign finance, very strong with independents. Protecting local election officials from harassment, and national standards for equipment, all very popular with independents. Republicans like local audits, increasing penalties for intimidation, national standards for equipment, and national standards for multiple forms of identifying documents. So a little bit of variation here, but still a very robust agenda. So where does that leave us? Your program could not be more aptly named. We are on the brink of some very serious concerns. We are on the brink of some very serious alienation, particularly among Republican voters, and you see that manifested in the region, the Upper Mountain, Rocky Mountain region that we're talking about here. At the same time, you see really a lot of concern about violence and a pretty disturbing faction within the Republican Party prone to violence, which we have not seen in the past. We see Republicans more alienated than independents, which is different than what we've seen in the past. But we see a very strong commitment to a bipartisan agenda on voting and very, very strong commitment to the Freedom to Vote Act and many of the components of the Freedom to Vote Act, even though no one knows it's on the agenda right now and no one knows what's in it. So let me pause there, and I think we've left a little bit of time for question and answers, and delighted to hear your comments as well as your questions. So I don't know, Chase or Gary, how we're handling questions.
Some questions in the chat box, but I think you've actually covered them all. And so I think we can wrap this up. And on behalf of the Frank Church Institute, thank you so much for these very timely and informative remarks. We really appreciate your doing this. And for our viewers after a lunch break, please join us at 1:30 p.m. Mountain Time for an afternoon panel that will be focused on Idaho specific. So thank you all, and thank you, Celinda.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure having been with you.